A security camera on a neighbor's house was running all night. It was pointed at their own driveway, but it also captured part of the street and the house across the street, 2825 Saratoga Trail. No one knew what it would record. No one turned it on intentionally. It just recorded what was happening, just as it did every night. 5:17 a.m. A man comes out of the garage. His name is Chris Watts. He walks to his work pickup truck, opens the back door, and goes back into the house. A few minutes later, he reappears in the frame. He's holding something. He carefully places it in the truck bed. He closes the door. He goes back inside again. Then he returns. This happens several times in a row. The recording quality doesn't allow for a clear view of what he is carrying. The camera only provides a general picture. But the main thing is noticeable. He isn't rushing. He isn't fidgeting. His movements are calm and deliberate. He acts as if he's performing a routine work task. Each time he leaves the house is recorded with a time code. The minutes add up to a long, continuous segment. The entire loading process takes about 30 minutes. This is too long for a typical morning routine.
It's also too long for random bustling. Everything looks like a process broken down into stages. 5:46 a.m. The pickup truck pulls out of the driveway. Chris heads to a site for the oil company Anadarko Petroleum, where he works as an operator. The location is about a 45-minute drive away. From the outside, it looks like a standard departure for a work shift. The next day, Chris Watts stands before local television cameras. He comes out onto the porch of that same house and reports Shanann's disappearance. He says that Bella and Celeste have disappeared along with her. He speaks to them through the camera lens, asking them to get in touch and come back. In the footage, he looks worried and distraught. His behavior fits the image of a man who genuinely doesn't understand what has happened. But the neighbor's camera archive already exists. The recording, with its clear timestamps, without words or emotions, captures the morning minute by minute. And it is this discrepancy between his public image and his recorded actions that will become the starting point for further verification, leading the investigation to its first uncomfortable conclusions.
To understand what happened in that house, one must first look at how the family appeared from the outside. This is how they were seen by neighbors, acquaintances, and thousands of people online. And from the outside, everything looked flawless. Shanann Watts led an extremely active life on social media. Her Facebook was not just a personal page, but a full-fledged showcase of family well-being. Posts appeared almost every day, sometimes several times a day. Vacations, family holidays, selfies with her husband, captions like "my best friend" and "the love of my life." Under the photos were dozens of comments from friends and followers. People wrote that they envied such a marriage and such a home. This was no accident. Shanann worked for the company Lavelle, network marketing, supplements, and patches under the brand Thrive. For such a business, social media is the primary tool. What's being sold isn't the product itself, but an image, energy, success, family harmony, and Shanann knew how to build and maintain that image. On her pages, everything looked curated. A large house in the suburbs, a well-kept yard.
A husband who was always by her side, smiling for the camera and participating in all the videos. Bella and Celeste in photo shoots, in matching outfits, at holidays and on trips. Travel, family dinners, weekends together. The content created a sense of stability and complete control over life. She and Chris met in 2010. They married 2 years later. At the time, he was working as a car mechanic in North Carolina. Shanann was slightly older and already had one failed marriage behind her. But Chris, by contrast, seemed like the complete opposite of her past experience. Calm, non-confrontational, reserved, not prone to arguing or insisting on his own way. This is how many would remember him. Neighbors would later say that he hardly stood out. He would say hello, he would smile, he participated in family life.
No scandals, shouting, or strange situations that might have alerted those around them. Outwardly, he was a completely ordinary suburban man. After the wedding, they moved to Colorado. Chris got a job as an operator at the oil company Anadarko Petroleum, a job with a clear schedule and a stable income. Shanann focused on her business and eventually achieved a good level of sales.
Bella and then Celeste were born into the family. Later, they bought a house in Frederick, a new neighborhood, a quiet street, a typical picture of a prosperous suburb. And all of this was constantly affirmed online. Post after post, video after video. Birthdays, beach trips, Chris in the kitchen making breakfast, family Halloween costumes, photos together in front of the mountains, smiles, hugs, hashtags about family and gratitude for life. In the summer of 2018, Shanann announced she was expecting a new addition to the family. The family said it would be a boy. They had already chosen a name, Nico. The news immediately became part of her content. Congratulations, reactions, a video of the family announcement. In this footage, Chris is smiling and supporting his wife, as always. On the night of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned from a business trip to Arizona. A Lavelle conference was held there, which she attended with colleagues. The last photos from the trip were taken at the Phoenix airport. She is smiling. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. While still in Arizona, she published her last post. An ordinary photo. A few lines of text. No alarming signals.
Just another element of her constructed image. This digital picture of family well-being, which Shanann had maintained for years, ended abruptly, and it wasn't the police who noticed. The first to raise the alarm was her close friend, Nicole Atkinson, the same one who had driven Shanann home from the airport. Nicole knew her routine well. They were constantly in touch. And when, on the morning of August 13th, Shanann didn't answer her messages and failed to show up for a scheduled doctor's appointment, it became clear that something out of the ordinary was happening. At that moment, the same picture still remained on social media: home, family, smiles, posts made just a few hours earlier. But in real life, contact with Shanann had been completely cut off. It was this discrepancy between the digital image and the actual absence that set off a chain of events, which within a few hours would lead the police to the door of that house and force them to look anew at everything that had previously seemed normal and stable. Nicole Atkinson had known Shanann for many years. They worked together at Lavelle, talked almost every day, and messaged constantly.
Nicole understood her routine well. Shanann didn't miss work meetings. She didn't disappear without warning. And she certainly wouldn't forget a doctor's appointment, especially in her condition. On the morning of August 13th, Nicole sent Shanann several messages. None of them were read. She called. The phone rang, but no one answered. This immediately seemed strange. Shanann was always available. For her, it was part of her job. She almost never let go of her phone. Nicole waited. At first, she thought Shanann was just sleeping. She had returned late at night from Arizona. The drive, the flight, the fatigue. It happens. But time passed. There was no reply. Nicole called again. Then she started messaging other friends, trying to find out if anyone knew where Shanann was. No one knew anything. By noon, her concern became concrete. Nicole got in her car and drove to the Watts' house. When she arrived, the first thing that caught her eye was Shanann's car. It was parked. Nicole knew this for a fact, because she herself had driven her home from the airport the night before. The front door was closed. Nicole rang the doorbell. Silence. She knocked. No reaction.
She walked around the house and looked in the windows. There was no movement inside. The house looked as if the morning had simply stopped. Nicole called Chris. He answered. He said he was at work. He reported that he had left early in the morning while Shanann was still asleep. Bella and Celeste, he said, were also at home. Everything was normal. He said he didn't understand why she wasn't answering. He suggested that her phone might have died or that she had gone out somewhere. This didn't convince Nicole. If Shanann had left, why was her car in the driveway? If her phone had died, why hadn't she left the house? If everything was normal, why had she missed the doctor's appointment she had prepared for in advance? At 1:40 p.m., Nicole called the Frederick police. She reported that her friend was not responding, that this was uncharacteristic of her, and that the situation was causing serious concern. A patrol car was dispatched to the address. Around the same time, Chris left work and drove home. He arrived at almost the same time as the police officers. Together, they approached the house. Nicole remained outside. Inside, everything looked calm.
There were no signs of a break-in. Things were in their places. The house did not give the impression of a space someone had left in a hurry. The bed was made. The kitchen was clean. Bella's and Celeste's things were in the living room. Then attention turned to Shanann's personal belongings. Her phone was in the house. Nearby lay her wallet and wedding ring. Shanann almost never left without these items. Her phone was her work tool and primary means of communication. These findings immediately changed the tone of the situation. It didn't fit well with the theory of a simple departure. A person in her position doesn't leave the house, leaving behind their phone, wallet, and ring, and doesn't take Bella and Celeste with her while leaving their belongings inside. Chris was in the house. He looked bewildered. He said he didn't understand what was happening. He repeated that everything had been fine in the morning, that they had talked, after which he left for work. A normal morning, nothing unusual. Throughout the day, the police continued their check. They questioned neighbors. This included paying attention to the recordings from security cameras installed on neighboring houses.
At the time, this seemed like a formal part of the inspection. The recordings were taken for analysis, without comment or conclusion. In parallel, they contacted Shanann's relatives in North Carolina. By the evening of August 13th, Shanann Watts, Bella, and Celeste were officially declared missing. Their photos were released to the media. The information began to spread throughout the area and on social media. That same day, Chris Watts gave an interview to the local television channel, Denver 7. He stood on the porch of his house and addressed his family through the camera. His voice was calm. He looked composed. Detectives watching this interview would later note one detail. Chris spoke as if he were addressing not those who could respond, but those who were no longer there. When the story of the family's disappearance became public, Chris Watts found himself at the center of attention. He didn't avoid the cameras or shut himself off from the press. That same day, he went out onto the porch of his own home and gave an interview to the television channel, Denver 7. He stood calmly. He looked directly into the camera. He said what was expected of him. He addressed Shanann.
He said he was waiting for her return. He mentioned Bella and Celeste. He repeated that the house was empty without them. The words sounded right, even without extra details. But for people who were already delving deeper into the story, a strange feeling arose. Chris did not look like a man whose entire family had disappeared just a few hours earlier. He didn't falter. He wasn't confused. He didn't seem thrown off balance. His speech was structured, as if he knew in advance what he would say and in what order. Later, detectives would return to this interview again and again, not because of specific phrases, but because of his intonation. Chris spoke distantly, as if describing the situation from the outside. At that moment, it couldn't be called evidence. It was more of an internal signal that is simply noted and set aside. In parallel, he gave his first detailed explanations to the police. Chris recounted the events of the morning of August 13th. According to him, he woke up around 5 o'clock and started getting ready for work. Shanann woke up too. They had a difficult conversation about their relationship. He said he had confessed his desire to separate. Shanann was upset.
After that, Chris claimed he left for work,
And when he returned later, no one was home. This version sounded convincing. Fights happen in families. People leave to stay with relatives or friends to get some distance. In the first few hours, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. But details remained that didn't allow the story to come together completely. Shanann's phone was in the house. Her wallet and wedding ring were there too. Her car was in the garage. This didn't seem like a planned departure, especially early in the morning and in her condition. No one contradicted Chris or asked him tough questions. His words were simply recorded. At the same time, they were gathering everything that could help reconstruct the picture of that morning. They spoke with neighbors. They clarified times. They checked who had seen movement at the house and when. One of the neighbors, Nate Trinistich, lived across the street. A Vivint security camera system was installed on his house. The cameras were pointed at his own driveway, but they also captured part of the street, including the garage of house number 2825. Nate himself offered to show the recordings.
He had already seen Chris's interview and wanted to help. Detectives came to his house and reviewed the archive for the early morning of August 13th. What appeared on the screen did not match Chris's story. At 5:17 a.m., a man emerges from the garage. It's Chris. He walks to his work pickup, opens the back door, and returns to the house. A short time later, he appears again. He's carrying something. He loads it into the truck bed. He leaves again. Then he returns once more. His movements are calm and sequential, without any fuss. This whole loading process takes about 20 minutes. At 5:46, the pickup pulls out of the driveway and heads toward the neighborhood exit. Shanann is not visible in the recording. She is not seen leaving the house. No other car that could have picked her up is visible. The camera records only Chris and his actions. This recording didn't answer all the questions, but for the first time, it showed the morning not through words, but through facts, with precise times and a clear sequence of actions. Chris said he had left for work, leaving Shanann, Bella, and Celeste at home. The camera showed a different morning. A morning in which he returns to the house several times and loads something into his pickup long before leaving. The recording from the neighbor's camera changed the course of this story. After that, people began to look at Chris Watts without sympathy. Until that moment, he had remained a figure around whom everything seemed to happen on its own. A husband whose family had suddenly disappeared. A man whose words were taken at face value simply because no other versions existed yet. But with the appearance of the video, the situation was no longer one-sided. Now, Chris's mourning no longer depended solely on his account. The next step was what always happens in such cases, even if it's rarely spoken of aloud. Detectives began to look closely at the man himself, not at the image he created and not at the impression from the interview, but at his life, his circle, and how he had existed up to that day. Chris grew up in North Carolina, in a family without major incidents or scandals. His father worked in manufacturing, his mother was a homemaker. There was a younger sister in the house. No problems in school, no conflicts with the law. Nothing that would immediately set him apart from thousands of other suburban guys. After school, he got a job as a car mechanic. Manual labor, straightforward tasks, a clear result. This suited his character well. Chris didn't seek to be the center of attention, nor did he try to stand out. He was used to doing what was expected of him and not asking unnecessary questions. After marrying Shanann, they moved to Colorado. There, Chris got a job as an operator at Anadarko Petroleum. Working on oil sites required discipline. Shifts, field trips, responsibility for equipment. Colleagues described him in the same way. Quiet, diligent, reliable. A person who was easy to work with because he didn't create problems. Neighbors said much the same. Polite, always said hello, would help if you asked. He was often seen in the yard with Bella and Celeste. He looked like a typical resident of a quiet suburb. Such a person rarely raises questions. But the longer detectives looked at this picture, the clearer it became that it was incomplete.
When the conversation turned to money, the calm quickly disappeared. The house on Saratoga Trail cost almost $400,000.
For a family where only one income was stable, this meant constant pressure. Shanann's business with Lavelle brought in money, but not consistently. There were good periods, but there were also months when the income almost vanished. In 2015, the family had already gone through bankruptcy. A significant amount was written off then. This provided a respite, but didn't solve the problem. After a while, the debts began to accumulate again. Mortgage, car, credit cards. By 2018, debt was once again part of their daily life. Meanwhile, on social media, everything looked different. Trips, photo shoots, new purchases, a constant sense that they were succeeding. This image required maintenance, and the more reality diverged from the picture, the more effort it took to hide it. Detectives didn't draw conclusions aloud, but they noted this background. Constant financial pressure, a house that was dragging them down, expectations that had to be met every day. In parallel, they recalled how Chris had behaved after his family's disappearance. When the police arrived at the house, he didn't look distraught. He wasn't running around the rooms. He didn't demand immediate action.
He calmly answered questions, showed where things were, and spoke in an even voice. Nicole Atkinson later said that this struck her immediately. She arrived in a state of alarm, expecting to see panic. Instead, she saw a man who was calm and seemingly detached. While the house was being searched, Chris called the facility that Bella and Celeste. This happened too soon. Only a few hours had passed. No one yet understood what was happening, but he was already acting as if there would be no return. Individually, such things could still be explained. Personality traits, stress, shock. But when it all came together, the story no longer looked so calm. By the evening of August 13th, one thing became clear. Chris's words were no longer treated as the account of a man who was simply unlucky. Now, they were listened to carefully and compared with what was already known. The next day, he was asked to take a polygraph test.
The request was made calmly, without pressure, as an opportunity to confirm his version of events and clear up any questions. Chris agreed immediately. He was confident he could pass the test. While Chris was preparing for the polygraph test, different work was underway at the house on Saratoga Trail. Without cameras, without journalists, and without conversation. Forensic specialists entered the rooms one by one, looking not at the overall picture, but at the small details, at things that don't usually catch the eye until you start comparing. At first, the house offered no answers. Everything looked calm, clean, tidy. No signs of haste. No overturned chairs or scattered belongings. For a house from which people had supposedly left early in the morning, everything looked too put together. The inspection began on the first floor. Kitchen. The table was clean. The sink was empty. The dishes were washed. Nothing unusual in the trash can. The living room looked like a typical living room in an inhabited house. Things were in their places. No sense that someone had been packing and rushing. The staircase, hallways, pantry. Everything looked equally calm.
The house didn't seem empty, but it also didn't look like someone had just left. More like a place where life was on pause. On the second floor, their attention lingered longer. The bedrooms were there, and it was there that details began to appear that couldn't be easily explained. Bella and Celeste's rooms looked normal. Toys lay where they were usually left. Books were on the shelves. Nothing was scattered. There was no sense that someone had been searching for something or doing anything in a hurry. But the beds looked unusual. The pillows and blankets were laid neatly. The bedspreads were straightened.
The beds looked not unmade, but rather prepared, and yet they had no sheets on them. At first, this didn't seem like a discovery. Sheets are often removed for washing. It happens in any house. The forensic team didn't jump to conclusions and simply checked the obvious. Washing machine, dryer, laundry baskets. There was laundry in them, but it was different. A normal load, unrelated to these beds. In the closets, there were clean sets of sheets, neatly folded. They hadn't been taken out. They hadn't been used. Meanwhile, the beds remained without sheets.
The same picture was repeated in Chris and Shenanon's bedroom. The bed looked made, the comforter and pillows were in place, the bedspread lay neatly, but there was no sheet. This did not look like a normal household situation. When you strip a bed for washing, you either leave it bare or remake it right away. That wasn't the case here. Several bedrooms looked the same, and this uniformity began to stand out. The forensics team noted this detail and moved on. No comments, no attempts to explain. They simply noted that it deviated from the usual logic of the house. In parallel, detectives were looking into the technology. They requested data from Chris Watts's work vehicle. The Anadarko Petroleum work pickup was equipped with a GPS tracker. Such a system records the route automatically, without driver input. The information came back quickly and without delay. On August 13th at 5:46 a.m., the pickup left the driveway of the house on Saratoga Trail. This matched the neighbor's camera recording exactly. After that, the vehicle headed north, toward the town of Roggen. The Survey 319 oil site was located there. According to the tracker, the pickup arrived at the site at 6:32 a.m.
Chris was there for about an hour and a half, after which he continued on to other locations. Looking only at the numbers, it seemed like a normal work route. But the detectives knew that Survey 319 was a remote site. There is no permanent staff there. Usually, such spots are checked quickly. An inspection takes 30, sometimes 40 minutes. Anything more is extra time. Chris spent almost twice that long there. The detectives re-examined a recording from the neighbor's camera. They checked the time he loaded the pickup, the moment of departure, the route, and the arrival at the site. Everything lined up perfectly. No gaps or inconsistencies. The house, early morning, loading the pickup, a trip to a remote location, a long stay there, and not a single piece of evidence to support the version that Shanann had left on her own. By the evening of August 14, the direction of the search was no longer vague. It was no longer spread out across the neighborhood and surrounding areas. All lines were converging on a single point on the map. The paperwork for a warrant was prepared immediately. The address was known, the time was recorded. There were sufficient grounds to act quickly.
A judge signed the papers the same day. Now, the next step depended not on guesswork, but on what exactly they would find at the scene. In parallel, they began to analyze Chris's behavior. While work continued at the house and papers were being prepared for the trip to the remote site, they focused on his phone. He handed it over himself, calmly, without trying to delete anything or explain in advance. He behaved as if he was sure there was nothing important on the device. The first thing they noticed were the messages he sent to Shannon after she disappeared. On the afternoon of August 13th, he wrote her several short texts. "Where are you? Call me. I'm worried." In themselves, these messages looked normal. This is what a person writes when they are waiting for a reply. But what was important was not the content, but the timing. Before Nicole Atkinson's call, Chris had not tried to contact his wife once. No messages, no missed calls. He left for work early in the morning and showed no initiative until midday. This didn't align well with his story of a difficult conversation that morning and the state in which, by his own account, he had left Shannon.
The messages only appeared after it became clear that the situation had gone beyond the family. When the police showed up at the house, when outsiders started calling. From that moment on, Chris began to write, and he wrote in such a way that the texts could easily be shown to anyone. They looked neat, no harsh phrasing, no panic. It didn't seem like spontaneous anxiety. Next, their attention turned to conversations that had nothing to do with the search, and almost immediately, another storyline was discovered. In Chris's phone, there was an active correspondence with a woman named Nicole Kessinger. She worked at the same company, Anadarko Petroleum, a contract geologist, younger than Chris. They had met in the summer of 2018. At first, the messages were formal. Work topics, short phrases. Then the tone changed. Personal conversations, flirting, late hours. By July, the correspondence had become regular and explicit. This no longer looked like a casual affair. Messages were sent almost every day. In them, they discussed meeting up, their feelings, and their plans. Chris wrote that he was in love, that he was tired of his life, that his marriage had been over for a long time.
He spoke of a future in which a different person would be by his side. All the while he was lying, consistently and without hesitation. He told Nicole Kessinger that he and Shannon were on the verge of divorce, that they were only living together formally, that there had been nothing between them for a long time. He did not mention that they were expecting another family member. He simply erased this fact from his version of his life. And Nicole genuinely did not know about it. By July, they had begun meeting secretly. Dinners, nights at her place. In early August, the correspondence became even more intense. They discussed a vacation together. They looked at housing options. Nicole searched online for wedding dresses. This was not a fantasy. These were concrete steps. Against this backdrop, Shannon continued to post family photos, videos, plans, smiles. Two worlds existed in parallel and never intersected. When Nicole Kessinger saw the news, she came forward on her own. She agreed to talk. She showed them the correspondence. She confirmed the relationship. She repeated the same thing. She did not know that a new family member was on the way.
She had nothing to do with the family's disappearance. The details and her behavior confirmed this. She was not a participant in what happened, but another person Chris was deceiving. For the investigation, her testimony was crucial. At home, Chris had a family, debts, and obligations. Outside the home, there was another woman and talk of a new life. A divorce would have meant losses and the need to explain the truth to everyone at once. The correspondence, the lies, and the secret affair added up to a very different story. On August 14, 2018, Chris Watts arrived at the Frederick Police Department to take a polygraph test. He did so voluntarily. He came alone, without an escort and without a lawyer. He signed the papers, walked down the hall, sat in a chair in a small, windowless room. By this point, he already understood that he was being viewed differently. The cameras, the phone, the recordings, the trip to the remote site. But outwardly, Chris remained calm. He didn't argue, didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't seem tense, more like composed, like a man who expected to get through the procedure and put an end to it.
The polygraph was administered by Tammy Lee, a specialist with extensive experience. For her, it was a routine work situation. She calmly explained the procedure without pressure or emotion. Everything was handled smoothly and matter-of-factly. Sensors were attached to Chris. They recorded his breathing, pulse, and overall physiological response to the questions. No mystique, just indicators that change when a person is under internal stress. First came the neutral questions: name, place of residence, simple facts that couldn't be answered otherwise. Chris answered confidently. His responses remained steady. The machine recorded a stable baseline. Then the topics changed. The questions concerned the morning of August 13. They concerned Shanann's whereabouts. They concerned Bella and Celeste. They concerned whether he knew what had happened to them. And it was on these questions that Chris's behavior began to change. Not sharply or demonstratively. His breathing became faster. He paused briefly before answering. He averted his gaze. These reactions were repeated every time the conversation returned to his family. The test didn't last long. It was enough to see a consistent pattern.
When the sensors were removed, Chris was still trying to remain calm, but the tension had become noticeable. He barely moved. He was silent for longer than usual. He avoided direct eye contact. After the results were analyzed, he was told he had failed the test. Not on one question, but on the entire group of key topics. Not because of a single glitch, but because of repeated reactions. For a man who had expected to confirm his story, this came as an unexpected blow. At that moment, Chris didn't ask for a lawyer for the first time. He asked for his father. Ronnie Watts was in Colorado. He had flown in immediately after hearing the news of the family's disappearance. A short time later, he was brought to the police station and led into an interview room. Father and son were left alone. The camera continued to record, without intervention, simply documenting what was happening. The conversation with his father was not an interrogation. They talked about the family, about what was happening, about what Chris had already told the police, about how it all looked from the outside. And it was in this conversation that Chris began to act differently.
He no longer spoke confidently and immediately. He paused, looked down, and stopped several times, as if he didn't know how to continue. Words that he had previously spoken calmly were now noticeably harder for him to say. While Chris was sitting in the interrogation room with his father, detectives were working on another part of the story. They sent the recording of his television interview to specialists in nonverbal behavior, people who can read body language more accurately than most people can read text. The interview for Denver 7, which Chris gave on the porch of his house on the evening of August 13, lasted only a few minutes. To the average viewer, it looked like a standard appeal on the news. But for the experts, this was more than enough time. Every gesture, every eye movement, every brief pause and micro-expression on his face told a separate story. And this story was very different from the one Chris was trying to show to the journalists and the police. The first thing they noticed was the absence of the usual signs of severe distress. When a person doesn't know where their loved ones are, the body usually reacts before the words do. Shoulders slump.
The voice loses its stability. Speech becomes halting. The person can't stand still, constantly shifting their posture, making unnecessary movements. Chris had none of that. He stood calmly. His torso was almost motionless. His shoulders were straight. His voice was steady. No trembling, no shortness of breath. He appeared composed and in control of the situation, as if he were talking about something unrelated, not about his home emptying out overnight. Then their attention was drawn to his facial expressions. They reviewed the video frame by frame, slowing down certain moments. In several segments, when Chris spoke about Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, something appeared on his face that one would not expect to see in such a situation. Short, almost imperceptible movements of the corners of his mouth. A micro-smile, which appears unconsciously and then vanishes. It didn't look like happiness. It was more like the reaction of someone feeling internal tension or a sense of control. Such expressions are difficult to track without slow motion, but they often betray a discrepancy between what a person is saying and what they are actually feeling.
Another detail concerned his speech itself. Experts carefully analyzed the phrasing Chris used, not individual words, but his overall way of speaking. When he mentioned Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, his phrases sounded as if he were describing not a temporary absence, but a situation that was already over. The house was empty without them. He wants them to be home. These constructions sounded detached, without a sense of expectation or searching. This way of speaking is called linguistic distancing, when a person subconsciously separates themselves from what they are talking about. It's not a conscious technique or an attempt to deceive with words. Rather, it's a consequence of an internal understanding that doesn't align with the official version. They also noted what was absent from the interview. Chris didn't address specific people. He didn't mention Shanann's parents. He didn't ask them to call or text. He didn't provide the details that are usually heard in such appeals. His words were general and impersonal, a brief address, with no attempt to latch onto anything real. All of this together did not seem like a mistake or a coincidence. It was a consistent pattern.
A calm delivery, an absence of emotional breakdowns, inappropriate microexpressions, detached language. Individually, such details could be explained by his personality or stress. Together, they formed the behavior of a person who knows more than he is saying. This conclusion added no new evidence and did not change the legal side of the case, but it strangely coincided with what was already on the surface, with the polygraph results, with the recording from the neighbor's camera, with the trip to the remote site. Everything was gradually falling into a single line. Ronnie Watts spent about an hour with his son. The camera in the interview room recorded everything without stopping. Father and son sat opposite each other. Ronnie spoke softly and calmly. He didn't pressure him or raise his voice. He asked Chris to tell him everything as it happened. He said that regardless of what he heard, he was still his father, that it was important for the family to know the truth, and that there was nowhere left to drag this out. Chris didn't break right away. At first, he was silent for a long time, staring at the floor. Then he broke down. He started crying. He choked on his words.
And only then did he begin to speak. And in the first few minutes, it was clear that his story was changing. Chris said that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste would not be coming back. He admitted that he knew where they were. He admitted that a breaking point had occurred in the house on the morning of August 13th, but he did not call himself the guilty party. Or rather, he did, but not completely. According to his new version, it all started with a conversation. Early that morning, he told Shanann he wanted to separate. He said he had another woman, that he was not going to live like this anymore. Shanann's reaction, he said, was sharp and emotional. After that, she went into Bella and Celeste's rooms. Chris claimed that he stayed in the bedroom. He heard some noises, but didn't pay them any mind. He thought Shanann was just packing and leaving. When he went to check, the situation was already beyond fixing. Bella and Celeste were lying without movement. According to Chris, he lost control after that. Everything happened quickly and without thinking. He said he acted in a state of extreme emotional distress. Then, according to his version, panic set in.
He didn't know what to do or how to explain what had happened. He decided to hide everything at once. He loaded all three into the pickup truck and drove to the Survey 319 worksite. The warrant to search that location was already prepared. Now all that was left was to verify what he himself had revealed. Chris pointed to the exact spot on the map at the Survey 319 site. He marked the area where, he said, Shanann was left. He named the numbers of the tanks he had used for Bella and Celeste. The police now had not only his words, but specific locations and coordinates. From the outside, Chris looked devastated. He spoke through tears. His voice broke. He gave the impression of a man who had survived a catastrophe and was trying to justify himself by saying he couldn't handle the situation. Those who listened to this recording understood that the story was too convenient. In it, the main burden of responsibility was placed on someone who could no longer say anything in response. Too many details didn't align with what had been recorded earlier, but this version still changed the course of the case.
Now, the focus was not only on his line of behavior, but on the need to verify every word on site. The medical examination was supposed to show what really happened and in what sequence, whether the evidence matched what he said, whether his words were confirmed by the facts. They listened to Chris until the end. They didn't interrupt. They didn't argue. It was a conscious step. When a person starts talking, you let them finish. Every detail can be used against them later. All that remained was to go there and check his words.
At dawn on August 15th, a team of specialists drove to the site. While forensics worked at the CERAV 319 site, back at the station, they continued to dissect the version Chris had given after speaking with his father. His version, that Shanann was to blame for what happened to Bella and Celeste, required verification. And for that, they needed to talk to the person for whom this all began. That person was Nicole Kessinger, the woman for whom Chris was willing to abandon his old life. Nicole was called in for questioning that same day. She came alone and immediately made it clear she was ready to cooperate. She looked distraught and frightened.
It was already clear that the scale of what was happening was entirely different from what she had imagined when she began the relationship. The conversation started calmly, without pressure, with simple questions: how they met, when they started talking, what Chris told her about his family. Nicole answered in detail and didn't try to evade any topics. They had met in June 2018 at one of Anadarko's work sites. Chris had impressed her as a calm and reliable person. He had initiated contact, suggested meeting, and talked about himself. And from the very beginning, he had created the image he wanted. He said his marriage was effectively over, that he and Shanann had long been living like roommates, that a divorce was a matter of time and formalities. He presented himself as a man emerging from a difficult relationship and trying to start a new chapter. Nicole believed him. She had no reason to doubt. On their dates, Chris didn't wear a wedding ring. He was free in the evenings and on weekends. He explained this by saying Shanann often traveled for work. He never said a word about them expecting another family member. This point was key. Chris had completely hidden it.
When investigators told her about it, she was in shock. She said that if she had known about the expected addition, the relationship would never have started. For her, this completely changed the situation. The girl was shown the messages found on Chris's phone, messages from July and early August, plans, talks about the future, discussions about living together. Nicole confirmed that it was all true. She really had been looking for places to live. He had said he wanted a fresh start. But in early August, Chris's behavior changed. He began to complain that the divorce process was dragging on. He said that Shanann didn't want to let him go. Nicole started insisting on some certainty. She needed to know where things were going and how much longer she had to wait. And here, a picture gradually began to emerge, one that didn't align well with Chris's story of an emotional breakdown. He was living two lives at once. In one, there was Shanann and their family, preparing for a new addition. In the other, there was Nicole, who was asking more and more often when he would stop lying. A choice would have to be made eventually. Divorce would have meant serious financial losses.
Division of assets, obligations, the loss of the house. With the debts he had already accumulated, this would have been a heavy blow. Moreover, Nicole would have inevitably found out about everything and most likely would have left him. Chris chose a path that seemed to him like a way out, to solve the problem radically and leave the past behind. This did not look like an impulsive decision. It was a calculation, selfish and cold. He placed his own convenience above everything else. Nicole gave her statement and confirmed all the key points. After the interrogation, she left the station in tears. For her, this story was also devastating. Soon after, she had to disappear from the public eye, change her name, and move away. Her testimony didn't reveal anything fundamentally new, but it coincided with unexpected precision with what the investigation had already seen, with the results of their checks, with the video recordings, with Chris's route that morning. By this time, the investigation had enough facts to stop guessing and building theories based on feelings. Everything Chris had said before could now be calmly broken down step by step and tested for strength. Nicole's testimony. The route to the work pickup truck, the neighbor's camera recording, the failed polygraph, his behavior in the TV interview, the oddities in the house.
Separately, each of these things could have still looked coincidental. Together, they formed a story that Chris's version just didn't fit into. The conversation was led by one of the lead investigators on the case, Dave Borzuk. He spoke calmly and without pressure. Such a tone gives a person nothing to latch onto and throws them off balance more quickly. Chris sat opposite him, exhausted, with a heavy gaze, but still clung to the story he had concocted after speaking with his father. He repeated it again with almost no changes. The morning conversation, the argument, what he supposedly saw in the rooms, his reaction. The investigator did not interrupt. He let him finish. And then he began to ask questions, not sharp ones, but simple and uncomfortable ones. He reminded him that in the situation Chris was describing, people grab their phones, even in a panic, even without understanding what is happening. They call emergency services. They ask for help. Chris did not do that. Not right away, and not later.
Then the conversation turned to the morning and the drive, step by step, leaving the house, the trip to the remote site, the long stop there, the return to his usual route. All of this required time, attention, and a clear understanding of his actions. This did not fit well with the story of a complete loss of control. After that, the conversation turned to the site itself, not about the discoveries or the results, but about how such places are set up, a restricted area, industrial tanks, narrow hatches, a space where one cannot act randomly. Any movement there requires effort and calculation. This is not like the chaotic actions of a person who is unaware of what they are doing. Chris listened with his head down. His answers grew shorter and shorter. Where there had once been prepared phrases, pauses now appeared. He said more and more often that he didn't remember or couldn't explain. The story he kept repeating was starting to crumble right in his hands. The investigator also reminded him of the other side of his life, about the woman with whom he was making plans, about the conversations about divorce that had been happening long before that morning.
About the fact that the family was expecting a new addition, which no one on the side knew about. All of this fit poorly with the version of a sudden breakdown. While the conversation was ongoing, a team was already working at the site at the locations Chris had previously indicated, without comments or conclusions, simply verifying his words step by step. At some point, he just stopped talking. He sat, staring at the table, and made no more attempts to continue. A pause hung in the room that could no longer be filled. His version didn't end because it was proven false. It ended with his silence. Survey 319 is a site far from residential areas, surrounded only by sparse industrial buildings, oil tanks, and dry plains. On a typical day, vehicles drive up, do their work, and leave, without attracting attention or leaving a trace. The search team arrived early in the morning. They had coordinates, equipment, and an understanding of which section to start with. An empty area. The heavy smell of petroleum products hung in the air. They began work at the first spot he had indicated, a small patch near some old utility lines. The soil there looked different, disturbed. Its density was different from the rest of the area. A few careful movements with a shovel, photo documentation, coordinates, everything followed procedure. It was at this spot that she was found, near the tanks, in a shallow depression, wrapped in a bedsheet taken from the bed in the house on Saratoga Trail. This discovery immediately connected the house and the Survey 319 site. What had previously existed in the form of routes, recordings, and testimonies now had direct, on-site confirmation. The work continued in silence, step by step, slowly and carefully. Nothing extraneous, not a single sudden move. Later, the personnel who worked at the scene admitted that this moment was one of the most difficult of their careers, because now before them was not a set of theories and assumptions,
but a concrete result. After that, they moved to the tanks, the ones he had named. Metal cisterns with narrow hatches just over 20 centimeters in diameter, a tiny access point to a huge tank holding thousands of barrels. For routine checks, such hatches are almost never used, but that day was not a routine day. Special equipment was brought to the site.
Preparations began, pumping out the contents, odor control, protective suits. Everything was done as is customary at industrial sites when working with hazardous materials. It was already clear that this was not a standard operation. They opened the hatch. They lowered probes. The liquid was thick, dark, viscous. First, they extracted a bedsheet, then another one. Then it became clear that what they had come for was inside. They discovered Bella and Celeste. Both were in the tanks he had named. Both were wrapped in bedsheets that had disappeared from the house. Everything matched in details that would be impossible to guess by chance, with no extraneous traces, with no signs of anyone else's involvement. The operation stretched on for several hours. Protective gear, photo documentation, measurements, reports. Those who worked at the scene later said that even days later, the feeling of the heavy smell lingered, not fading from memory. But at a certain point, the smells ceased to matter. From then on, they worked only with what could be documented and verified. When the work at the site was completed, the specialists recorded the most important finding.
All three had been there for a considerable time. There were no signs indicating any possibility of life. The nature of the findings allowed for an unequivocal conclusion about the cause of what had happened. The theory of an accidental tragedy or panic was no longer considered at this stage. Later, after the initial procedures were completed, the medical examination confirmed another important detail. The family had indeed been expecting a new addition. This was an established fact, not a guess. The name of the future family member had already been discussed. Nico. These conversations were very recent. After the morning of August 13th, they lost all meaning. Everything Chris had talked about was confirmed at the scene. All that remained was to gather the materials, formalize the forensic results, and document the chain of events as it had actually occurred. By this point, it was clear that the story would not be limited to just theories. Chris had changed his story twice. First, he said the family had simply disappeared and he knew nothing. Then he claimed it all happened in the house after a conversation and tried to blame Shanann. Both stories crumbled under the weight of the facts, but there was one important piece still missing. They needed to hear not another contrived scheme, but a complete narrative. How he himself constructed that night from beginning to end, without skipping around or making excuses. Chris had been in isolation for several months and understood a simple thing. He couldn't drag it out any longer. His previous words no longer worked. They didn't explain what was found at the site, didn't match the routes, and didn't fit the details. This conversation came as a surprise to no one, especially not to him. In February 2019, Chris agreed to give a new statement. Not at the station and not at the scene of the events. In a private room, without the public, without news cameras. Just him and the people who already knew almost everything. A camera recorded the entire conversation without stopping. From the first few minutes, it was clear he was speaking differently, without tension, without trying to evoke sympathy, without the emotions everyone had grown used to before. He didn't make excuses or argue. He just told the story, evenly, calmly.
As if he were talking not about his own life, but about someone else's story. He started with the evening of August 12th, with how Shanann returned home from her trip. She was tired but wanted to talk. She sensed that something between them had changed. Chris confirmed this.
He said that in recent weeks he had been cold, distant, and often withdrawn. He answered questions evasively. The conversation led to nothing. They went to bed. Chris admitted that he didn't sleep. He lay there and thought about Nicole, about how long he had been living a double life, about how tangled everything had become, and that he had already made a decision but hadn't said it out loud. Next, he moved on to what happened during the night, without detailed descriptions, without emotion. He said that Shanann was asleep, that she didn't have time to understand what was happening. He spoke about it as evenly as he spoke about everything else, without pauses, without a tremor in his voice. Then he described how he began to act next, how he took the bed sheets, how he prepared the truck, how he returned to Bella and Celeste's rooms. He said they woke up and didn't understand what was happening.
That he answered them briefly and calmly, saying they had to go. He described the drive to Survey 319 without detail, like a familiar route, as if he were driving to a normal work shift. He said that the whole time he understood what he was doing and did not try to stop. At the site, he recounted the sequence of his actions calmly and without pauses. Everything happened in a single sequence without skipping around. He didn't get confused. He didn't jump from one thing to another. He didn't change the order. Everything matched what the investigation already knew. When the conversation turned to his motive, he didn't evade the question. He said it directly. He wanted to be with Nicole. He wanted to start a new life. Divorce seemed too complicated and destructive to him. Finances, the house, future obligations, and most importantly, the fear that Nicole would find out about the expected new addition to the family and leave him. He didn't speak of remorse. He didn't speak of regret. He simply explained his choice the way one explains an action they consider logical. At some point, he simply fell silent. He had said everything he was prepared to say at that moment.
After that, the conversations were no longer the main focus. They needed to piece together the night step by step, the timeline, movements inside the house, what he was doing, what was happening around him, not according to his explanations, but according to verifiable facts. The confession became the starting point for the reconstruction. Investigators took Chris's story and began to verify it point by point. GPS data from the work pickup, the neighbor's camera recording, phone activity, medical reports, testimonies from people who saw Shanann that evening. All of this needed to be assembled into a single timeline, not in general terms, but by time, minute by minute, without assumptions. August 12, 2018, around 10:30 p.m., Nicole Atkinson drives Shanann home from Denver International Airport. The car stops at the house on Saber Creek Drive. Shanann gets out, waves to her friend, and goes inside. Street cameras do not capture this, but it is confirmed by Nicole's testimony. After that, no one saw her again. Then began the night that would later have to be pieced together from fragments. According to Chris, Shanann came up to the bedroom around 2 in the morning.
They talked, then went to bed. But phone data is more precise. At 1:48 a.m., Shanann sends her last text message to a friend. After that, her phone shows no more activity. No calls, no messages, no movement. Between 4 and 4:30 in the morning, according to Chris's confession, the key moment occurs. Shanann was asleep. He went to the bed and took irreversible action. The medical examination would later record signs that are consistent with this version. She did not have time to wake up. Her state indicated it happened quietly. From 4:30 to 5 a.m., Chris acts methodically. He removes the bed sheet from the bed, wraps Shanann in it, and carries her to the garage. He places her in the bed of the pickup truck. He returns to the house. He goes to Bella and Celeste's rooms. He wakes them. He tells them they have to go. They are sleepy, confused, and don't understand what is happening. At 5:17 a.m., a neighbor's camera records movement by the garage. Chris goes in and out several times. He loads something into the pickup. He does this calmly, without any fuss. The recording lasts for about 20 minutes.
No sudden movements, no signs of panic.
At 5:46 a.m., the pickup truck leaves the driveway. The GPS begins to record the route. The truck moves toward Roggen, to the work site, Survey 319. Bella and Celeste are in the cab. Shanann is in the truck bed, wrapped in a bed sheet. At 6:32 a.m., the pickup arrives at the site. This is confirmed by GPS data. Chris parks next to the tanks. According to him, the first thing he does is take a shovel from the truck bed and start digging. Investigators would check this detail as well. The soil at the site is soft and sandy. It is indeed possible for one person to dig a shallow depression in 15-20 minutes. From 6:50 to 7 a.m., Chris moves Shanann from the truck bed and places her in the hole he dug. He covers her with earth. During this time, Bella and Celeste remain in the truck. According to him, Bella started to cry and call for her father. These details would later match what was established by the forensic examination. From 7:30 to 8 a.m., the pickup remains stationary. The GPS shows no movement. Chris puts away his tools, inspects the area, and makes sure nothing is left in sight. He is not in a hurry.
At exactly 8 a.m., the truck leaves Survey 319 and heads toward the next work sites. A normal operator's route. Chris checks equipment, takes photos, fills out work logs. There is nothing in his actions that would deviate from a typical schedule. When investigators put all the time points together, there were no discrepancies left. The route, camera recordings, GPS data, and his own words all matched. This sequence did not look spontaneous. There was no chaos in it. Everything happened within a clearly structured order. By this point, everything was clear. The sequence was reconstructed, the details matched, and no contradictions remained. From here, this story ceased to be an investigation. Everything that had been gathered over these days and weeks was now destined to be heard in a different place. By November 2018, the case materials were fully prepared. The Weld County District Attorney's Office charged Chris Watts with 9 counts. Separately for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Separately for Nico. Plus related charges connected to how he tried to hide what happened and mislead those around him. Under Colorado state law, the ultimate penalty could be considered in such cases. Formally, the prosecution had every reason to pursue it. The confessions were recorded, physical evidence had been obtained, the timeline was reconstructed. The defense's version did not stand up to scrutiny. But the case never went to a full jury trial. A few weeks before the scheduled hearings, the defense entered into negotiations. The terms were simple. Chris would plead guilty to all charges, without contest, without appeal. In return, the prosecution would drop its demand for the ultimate penalty. Instead, he would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the prosecution, this meant closing the case without a months-long public trial. For Shanann's family, it meant avoiding a re-examination of all the details in a courtroom. After consulting with Shanann's parents, the decision was made to accept the plea deal. November 6, 2018, Weld County Courthouse. Chris Watts sits at the defense table in a prison jumpsuit. His hands are shackled. His expression is calm, almost detached, the same as it was during the interrogations. Judge Marcelo Kopko reads the charges, count by count. After each one, the formal question of his plea is asked.
The answer is always the same, short, devoid of emotion, guilty. 9 times in a row. After that, Shannon's family is given the floor. Her father speaks about his daughter and what was taken from the family. Without long phrases or attempts to prove anything, he looks at Chris and asks a question to which he expects no answer. Her mother speaks next, about the loss, about how there will be no forgiveness, about how the only thing she waits for is for Chris to never be free again.
Shannon's brother also speaks. He talks about Bella and Celeste, about what they were like in their normal lives, briefly, without details. The courtroom is silent. The judge addresses Chris directly. He says that in his years on the bench, he has seen many cases, but this is one of the most difficult. Not only because of what happened, but because of how Chris behaved afterward, how he tried to present himself as a different person, how he shifted blame and continued to lie. Then the sentence is read. 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, separately for each count. In addition, sentences for the related charges. Chris listens to the sentence in silence. There is no reaction. Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin is a place where the days cease to be different from one another. Maximum security, solitary cells. A person remains alone almost all the time. Chris Watts has been living in this mode since November 2018 and will continue to do so. His former life ended where this isolation began. But even behind bars, he did not disappear from view. Interest in the case has not waned over time. Journalists, documentary filmmakers, and psychologists have continued to seek contact with him. And Chris has not closed himself off. He answers letters, he agrees to conversations, he returns to his story again and again. And each time it sounds a little different. New details appear somewhere. The emphasis shifts elsewhere. Sometimes he speaks of remorse, other times he drifts into discussions about faith. But if you compare these words with what he said before, you get the feeling that the story continues to adapt, not for the sake of punishment, not for the sake of the court, but for the sake of feeling in control of how he is perceived. Over time, this case ceased to be a private story from one county.
It began to be analyzed as an example of what specialists call a family annihilator, people who destroy their own families while remaining outwardly normal until the very last moment, with no criminal records, with no obvious warning signs. This is what is most frightening. Shannon's social media inevitably drew special attention. After the sentencing, people returned to her posts in droves. They looked at the photos, videos, captions. From these images, it was impossible to see what was coming. On the outside, it looked like the life of thousands of other families. This is felt especially sharply when 2 images are placed side by side. In one, Chris is on a family vacation, smiling, hugging Shannon, with Bella and Celeste nearby. In the other, he is in a prison uniform, the same facial features, but his gaze is empty and detached, and between these 2 pictures are not years, but only a few months. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico are laid to rest together. People continue to visit, leaving flowers, notes, and toys. Many of them never knew the family, but they remembered this story, because for so long it looked so ordinary.